Imagine waking up to one shocking headline. Russia has lost Crimea. No celebrations, no speeches, just silence. Markets crash, governments panic, and the world quietly changes forever. But what really happens next? Let's break it down. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are exploring a question that once sounded impossible, but is now discussed seriously by experts around the world. What really happens if Russia ever loses Crimea? This video is not predicting the future. It is explaining consequences. Crimea is not just a piece of land. It is history, strategy, identity, and power combined. When Russia took control of Crimea, global politics shifted overnight. Sanctions followed quickly. Trust between major powers collapsed. And a long period of confrontation began. Now imagine the opposite situation. Imagine Russia no longer controls Crimea. The first reaction would not be celebration. It would be shock and confusion. Inside Russia, this would feel like a psychological earthquake. Crimea has been portrayed as permanent and unquestionable. Losing it would challenge that belief deeply. State media would struggle to control the narrative. Officials would choose words very carefully. International leaders would avoid emotional statements. Markets would react faster than governments. Energy prices would move suddenly. Currencies would respond within hours. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings would begin. But the biggest change would be invisible to most people. The global perception of strength would shift. Crimea represents certainty in Russian messaging. Losing it would signal vulnerability. That signal would travel far beyond Eastern Europe. This video breaks those consequences down calmly and clearly. No emotion, only realistic outcomes. Politically, the impact inside Russia would be complex and layered. This would not mean instant collapse or chaos. Strong political systems absorb shocks. But this shock would be historic in scale. Crimea is closely tied to national pride. Its loss would create silent doubt rather than loud protest. Elite circles would quietly reassess loyalty and strategy. Security institutions would conduct internal reviews. Policymakers would rethink long-term planning. Opposition voices would gain confidence indirectly. Not through mass rallies, but through private conversations and influence. Internationally, governments would respond with caution. Sanctions policies would come under review. Some restrictions might soften slowly. Others could tighten temporarily. Western leaders would avoid humiliation narratives. Instability benefits no one. China would observe the situation carefully. Moments like this are studied by rising powers. For Russia's neighbors, the message would be powerful. Borders are not always permanent. Defense planning across Eastern Europe would intensify. NATO would adjust its posture defensively. Military exercises would increase quietly. Diplomatic communication would remain constant. This would be a moment of recalculation, not celebration, not victory, not defeat, but reassessment. When a major power loses territory, the entire global system becomes cautious. That caution shapes political decisions for many years. Economically, uncertainty would appear before any concrete damage. Financial markets fear uncertainty more than bad news. Russian markets would react immediately. Currency pressure would increase. Investors would pause major decisions. Capital would hesitate rather than flee instantly. Energy exports would continue. But insurance costs would rise. Shipping routes across the Black Sea would be reassessed. Crimea plays a role in regional logistics. Ports matter. Transport matters. Control matters. Losing Crimea would complicate trade planning. Tourism development would stop instantly. State-supported projects would freeze. Government budgets would require adjustment. Spending priorities would shift towards security. Social programs would face quiet pressure. The effects would be slow, not dramatic, but noticeable over time. International companies would adopt a wait-and-see approach. Waiting itself is costly. Ukraine's economy would also face strain. Rebuilding Crimea would be expensive and slow. Infrastructure repairs would be required. Administrative systems would need replacement. Legal disputes would take years to resolve. Global financial institutions would step in cautiously. Loans would come with conditions and oversight. Everyone would demand stability first. Economic recovery depends on predictability. Crimea's status would redefine that predictability across the region. Militarily, Crimea is extremely sensitive territory. It hosts important naval and air facilities. Losing control would force rapid adjustments. Russia would reposition forces rather than retreat completely. The balance of power in the Black Sea would change. That change would concern several countries immediately. Turkey would monitor developments closely. NATO would avoid provocative actions. Every movement would be carefully calculated. Miscommunication would be dangerous. Diplomatic hotlines would remain active at all times. Ukraine would face serious responsibilities. Securing Crimea would require discipline and restraint. Any aggressive move could escalate tensions quickly. International monitoring mechanisms could be discussed. Not immediately, but as a stabilizing option. Military planners would focus on containment, not expansion. Exercises would increase quietly across the region. Surveillance activity would intensify. There would be no public drama, only constant assessment behind the scenes. Modern military strategy values stability over spectacle. Territory is important, but escalation control is more important. One wrong signal could trigger a wider crisis. Avoiding that outcome would be the top priority. Crimea's military transition would test crisis management skills. Success would depend on coordination, clear communication, and patience from all sides involved. Diplomatically, the world would slow its language and actions. Statements would be carefully written and measured. Recognition decisions would not be rushed. Legal status would dominate international discussions. Experts in international law would debate precedents endlessly. United Nations meetings would increase significantly. Draft resolutions would circulate quietly. Veto calculations would influence every move. Behind closed doors, negotiations would intensify. For Ukraine, legitimacy would be essential at every step. Actions would require international validation. For Russia, dignity would be protected intentionally. Humiliation creates instability, not peace. Major powers understand this lesson well. European governments would coordinate closely. Energy security would dominate diplomatic talks. Supply routes would be reviewed carefully. Emergency reserves would be evaluated. Smaller states would seek reassurance from allies. Defense commitments would be clarified. This would not be a moment of triumph. It would be a moment of management. Managing risk, managing expectations, managing narratives. Media coverage would simplify events dramatically. Diplomats would do the opposite. They would focus on timelines and procedures. Transition mechanisms would be discussed. Monitoring systems would be designed. Crimea would become a global test case, a test of whether territorial change can be managed without wider chaos. Inside Crimea, life would not transform overnight. Ordinary people care most about stability. Jobs, electricity, water, and personal safety matter above politics. Administrative transitions would create confusion. New authorities would impose new systems and laws. Trust in local institutions would be fragile. Some residents would feel relief, while others fear uncertainty. Most would adapt quietly, prioritizing routine. Questions of identity and language would emerge. Property rights could face legal challenges, requiring careful review. These changes take years, not months. Patience and stability would be essential. International observers might monitor local transitions. They would ensure rights protection and prevent abuses. Economic incentives would be introduced carefully. Infrastructure projects would be prioritized. Employment initiatives would support stability. However, corruption risks increase with large funding. Strict oversight would be necessary. Social cohesion would be the most critical challenge. Winning public trust is slow and subtle. Mistakes could be amplified by media and social networks. Every incident could be politicized externally. Managing expectations with realism is essential. Crimea's transition would be judged globally. Success depends on transparent governance, calm administration, and avoiding revenge narratives. Peace is not declared suddenly. It is carefully constructed over time through deliberate, patient decisions. Globally, Crimea's symbolic impact would be massive. Power perception is influenced by territorial control. Crimea has historically symbolized Russian defiance of post-Cold War norms. Losing it would reshape global assumptions about power permanence. Other disputed regions would reassess their strategies. Not acting immediately, but reevaluating risk and strategy. That distinction matters significantly. Governments study examples like this carefully. Deterrence policies would be revised. Red lines in diplomacy would be refined, not erased. Authoritarian states might tighten internal control. Democratic societies would debate intervention limits and foreign policy constraints. Public opinion would shift subtly but meaningfully. War fatigue affects decision-making worldwide. Crimea would become a case study in strategy and risk. It would be analyzed in military academies and think tanks, referenced in diplomatic negotiations for years. Long-term strategic planning would adapt to this scenario, not emotionally, but rationally. Global systems rely on predictable outcomes. Crimea's loss would temporarily reduce predictability. Systems adapt, but adaptation takes time. During this period, decisions would become more conservative. Risk tolerance decreases across nations. This affects trade, security alliances, and global crisis management. Crimea's influence would last decades as a reminder that territorial disputes carry long-term consequences. Media and information narratives would play a central role. Competing versions of events would spread instantly online. Social platforms amplify extremes. Balanced, fact-based analysis would struggle for attention. Governments would attempt narrative control. Fact-checking often lags behind rapid information flow. This environment creates volatility. Public opinion influences political and economic decisions, especially in democracies, where leaders must respond to perception. Misinformation risks would increase sharply. Every image and report would be scrutinized. Trust in media and institutions could erode temporarily. Cyber and information operations would intensify quietly. Information warfare adapts alongside territorial changes. Media literacy becomes essential for populations. Audiences must process context, sources, and intent carefully. Speed dominates online behavior over accuracy. This pressures officials to respond quickly, sometimes prematurely. Rapid statements increase risk of misinterpretation. In such moments, silence can be safer than commentary. However, silence is easily misread by international observers and local populations. Managing perception becomes as critical as managing reality. Crimea would dominate global headlines for months. Eventually, coverage would fade, but narratives and perceptions would linger. These lingering narratives shape memory. Memory shapes future policy. Who controls the story matters, but how it is told matters more. The informational dimension would influence outcomes far beyond immediate territorial control. Long-term consequences would settle into patterns, though stability would not be perfect. Russia would recalibrate its political and military strategy. Internal resilience would be strengthened. Efforts to prevent future shocks would intensify. Ukraine would face challenges of reconstruction, integration, and governance. Expectations would require careful management. International support would be conditional, with oversight on reforms and administration. Crimea would not experience instant prosperity. Transitions of this magnitude take years or generations. Global attention would shift to new crises, but lessons remain. Territory gained through force carries hidden long-term costs. Reversals of control are complex and expensive. There are no clean victories in modern geopolitics. Only managed outcomes exist. Future conflicts would be approached with greater caution. Diplomacy would regain practical importance, not just moral weight. Unpredictability is costly in global strategy. Military planners would emphasize exit strategies and contingency planning. Economists would stress long-term viability of sanctions and financial systems. Political leaders would measure domestic tolerance carefully. Crimea would serve as a warning, not a symbol of triumph or defeat, but of consequence. The global system is fragile, and every territorial shift creates pressures that ripple far beyond the battlefield. Understanding these consequences is essential for policymakers and observers alike. In conclusion, losing Crimea would not end the world, but it would change it permanently. Power perception would shift, confidence would be tested, and global systems would adapt slowly. This scenario is not about winners or losers. It is about consequences. Every major decision creates ripples, some visible, some hidden. Crimea represents a collision of history, strategy, and identity. Understanding this collision matters. Not to take sides, but to see reality clearly. Certainty is rare in modern geopolitics. Flexibility and resilience matter more than ever. Crimea's future will influence conflict management worldwide. Through careful calculation. Through strategic restraint. Through lessons learned the hard way. If you found this analysis useful, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel for calm, fact-based breakdowns. Share this with someone who wants understanding, not noise. And comment below. Do you think the world is ready for such a moment? Your perspective matters. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.